Rain hammered the tin roof of a small repair shop in Millbrook when a black car stopped outside, and a woman in a tailored gray coat stepped out holding a folder that would change everything. "My father has died." Staring at the man wiping grins, "But I came to pay his debt." Daniel Reyes stood in the doorway of his shop, his 8-year-old daughter from behind a stack of tires, and for a moment the only sound, wooden metal and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, because the last thing he expected on a Tuesday evening was for the daughter of Walter Ashford, the man who had ruined his life 6 years ago, to be standing on his doorstep and an apology he never asked for. Daniel had built Reyes Auto Repair from nothing, working 16-hour days after his wife passed, raising his daughter Lily alone in the back room of a shop that smelled like oil and hope. 6 years ago, he had trusted Walter Ashford with his life savings, $40,000, believing in a business partnership that promised to expand his small garage into a chain across 3 counties. Walter had smiled with perfect teeth, shaken his hand like they were brothers, and then vanished with the money 3 weeks later, leaving Daniel with nothing but a foreclosure notice and a daughter who cried herself to sleep in a motel room because they had lost their house. Daniel never went to the police, never chased Walter through courts he could not afford. He simply put his head down, rebuilt slower, quieter, angrier, and told himself that some debts never get repaid. They just get buried under years of silence. Now the daughter of that same man was standing in his shop, rain dripping from her coat onto his concrete floor, her eyes red-rimmed but her spine straight, the posture of someone who had learned to hold herself together in rooms full of men who wanted her to fall apart. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, his voice flat, guarded, the tone of a man who had been burned once and refused to be burned twice. "You need to leave. I have a kid here." Lily stepped further behind the tire stack, but her eyes stayed locked on the stranger, curious in the way only children can be curious about grief they don't yet understand. The woman did not leave. She introduced herself as Vivian Ashford, CEO of Ashford Logistics, a company Daniel vaguely recognized from billboards on the highway, the kind of company that sponsored charity galas and appeared in business magazines with headlines about growth and innovation. "My father passed away 3 days ago," Vivian said, her voice cracking despite her obvious effort to keep it steady. "Heart attack. I was going through his private files, the ones he kept locked away from the company, and I found records. Your name. $40,000 taken in under a fake partnership agreement, never repaid. There were others too, but most of them I can't find anymore. You're the only one still here, still in this town." She held out the folder like it was made of glass. "I want it right." Daniel stared at the folder without taking it. Not memories flooding back of nights he had spent calculating how many months behind he was on rent, of the humiliation of asking his brother for gas money, of Lily asking why they moved out of their old house, and him not having an honest answer that wouldn't break her heart. "Making it right," he repeated, almost laughing, though there was no humor in it. "You think a piece of paper fixes 6 years?" Vivian did not flinch. "No," she said quietly, "but a check might help you sleep easier, and I intend to write one, whether you forgive my father or not. This isn't a forgiveness. It's about debt. I'm paying it." Her hand trembled slightly as she said it, and Daniel noticed, filing it away without understanding why it mattered yet. He should have taken the check and closed the door. That would have been the simple version of this story, the one where a rich woman shows up, writes a number, and drives away feeling lighter while a poor man learns to trust again. But Daniel had learned the hard way that people who show up with folders and apologies usually want something else buried inside the kindness, some second agenda, folded into the first one like a hidden compartment in a suitcase. So instead of taking the folder, he asked the question that would unravel everything neither of them expected. "Why now? Your father's business is huge. He's got lawyers, accountants, people whose entire job is making problems disappear quietly. Why would his own daughter, a CEO with a company to run, drive 2 hours in the rain to hand-deliver a check to a mechanic in a town nobody's heard of? Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since she'd stepped out of the car, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for far longer than 3 days. She sat down on an overturned bucket near the workbench, uninvited, the fabric of her expensive coat brushing against grease stains without her seeming to care. "Because I found something else in his files," she said, her voice dropping so that Lily, still watching from behind the tires, wouldn't hear the words clearly. "Something about my mother. About why she left when I was 12. I always thought she abandoned us because she didn't love me enough to stay. That's what my father told me, every year, every birthday she missed. But there were letters, Mr. Rise. Letters she wrote to him, begging him to let her see me, and money transfers, payments made to keep her away, to keep her quiet. My father didn't just steal from strangers. He stole my mother from me too and dressed it up as her choice." Her hands were shaking now, not from cold, and Daniel found himself, against every instinct built by 6 years of bitterness, pulling a second bucket over and sitting down across from her. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Vivian said quickly, straightening again, rebuilding the wall she had let slip for a moment. "I'm telling you because paying back people he cheated, starting with you, is the only way I know how to prove to myself that I'm not him. That I didn't inherit whatever was broken in him." Daniel studied her face, the exhaustion under her makeup, the way her fingers kept twisting a ring on her right hand, and he felt something shift inside him that he wasn't ready to name yet, a crack in 6 years of armor. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said finally. "Just the money if you're serious." But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't going to be that simple, because Vivian Ashford had the look of someone who had just discovered the ground beneath her entire life was built on a lie, and people like that don't walk away after writing one check. They come back. Deeper. And digging deeper in this town, Daniel realized with a cold, sinking feeling, was going to unearth things he had spent 6 years trying to keep buried too. Vivian left that night without Daniel accepting the check, telling her he needed time to think, though the truth was he needed time to figure out what she wasn't saying. Lily, once the car pulled away, tugged on her father's sleeve and asked, "Was that lady sad, Daddy?" And Daniel knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from his daughter's face, and said the only honest thing he could manage. "Yeah, baby. I think she's carrying something real heavy." Lily nodded like she understood completely the way children do, and asked if they could have grilled cheese for dinner. And Daniel laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, grateful for the small mercy of a child who could pull him out of his own head. 3 days passed before Vivian returned, this time without the folder, wearing jeans and a plain jacket instead of a tailored coat, looking less like a CEO arriving to fix a public relations problem and more like a woman who genuinely didn't know where else to go. Daniel was under a car when he heard her footsteps, and he rolled out on the creeper to find her standing there again, rain-free this time, but just as unsettled. "I did some digging," she said without preamble, "about the partnership contract my father used against you. I found the original documents. Mr. Rise, he didn't just take your money for a business expansion that fell through. He never intended to open those garages. The whole thing was a shell, set up to launder money for a supplier he was in debt to. You weren't a failed investment. You were a target." Daniel sat up slowly, the words landing like something heavier than he was ready to hold. "A target," he repeated. "For what?" Vivian's expression tightened, the look of someone about to cross a line she had promised herself she wouldn't cross. "There's a man named Carl Denning," she said. "He supplied auto parts to half the shops in this county 15 years ago until he got involved in something illegal, moving stolen vehicle parts through legitimate businesses to clean the money. My father owed him a debt from a bad investment, and instead of paying with his own funds, he used yours. He funneled your $40,000 through a fake garage partnership straight into Denning's operation, then let the whole thing collapse so it would look like an ordinary failed business deal. instead of what it actually was. You didn't just lose money, Mr. Reyes. You were used to cover for a criminal enterprise, and you never even knew it. Daniel felt the shop tilt slightly around him, not from surprise about being cheated, he'd known that for years, but from the sudden, dizzying realization that the betrayal went deeper and darker than a greedy man breaking a handshake. It meant someone out there, this Carl Denning, had profited from his family's suffering and never once faced a single consequence. "Why does this matter to you?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper now, suspicion creeping back in despite the vulnerability she'd shown days earlier. "You could have just written the check and let this stay buried. Instead, you're digging up criminal connections. That's not repayment, Vivian, that's a war you're about to start. And it's not your war." Vivian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Daniel saw something in her he recognized from his own reflections and mornings. The exhausted determination of someone who had decided that doing the right thing, more than doing the safe thing. "Denning is still operating," she said. "Under a different name, a different company, but it's him. And 2 weeks ago I found evidence he approached my father's company again, this time trying to pull the same scheme through one of our smaller logistics subsidiaries. If I don't expose this now, it doesn't just stay in the past, Mr. Reyes. It repeats. Someone else becomes you. Some other family loses everything while men like Denning walk away clean." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, the shop quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner where he kept sodas for customers, and he realized that Vivian Ashford wasn't just trying to fix her father's mistakes. She was trying to stop history from repeating itself, and somehow, without either of them intending it, his ruined life had become the evidence she needed to do it. Over the following 2 weeks, something unexpected began to grow between them. Not romance, not yet, but a fragile, cautious partnership built on shared wounds neither one had expected to find understood by a stranger. Vivian came to the shop most evenings after work, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes to sit and talk while Daniel finished up jobs, and Lily, in the unguarded way of children, decided she liked Vivian without needing a reason, showing her drawings, asking her to help with homework, once even asking if Vivian could come to her school's family day since her own mother wasn't there to come. Vivian had gone still at that request, her eyes glassy, and later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep on the shop's old couch during a rerun of a cartoon, Vivian admitted to Daniel that she had never had anyone ask her to be part of something so simple and warm before. "My whole life has been boardrooms and mergers," she said quietly. "Nobody's ever asked me to come to a family day." Daniel, surprising himself, told her she should come, and the way her face lit up in response told him this fragile new thing them was becoming something neither of them had planned for. But the investigation into Denning was not without danger, and it revealed itself one evening when Daniel found his shop door pried open, tools scattered, nothing stolen but a clear message left behind. A single business card on his workbench with Denning's old company name printed on it, no note, no explanation needed. Vivian arrived within the hour, her face pale when she saw it, and for the first time since this had all begun, Daniel saw real fear behind her composed exterior. "He knows we're looking into him," she said. "This is a warning." Daniel felt the old protective instinct roar up inside him, the same one that had kept him working 16-hour days to keep Lily fed and safe, and he realized that whatever this was between him and Vivian, it had already become bigger than a debt repaid. It had become a shared fight, and fights like this one didn't end quietly. They took the evidence to a detective Vivian trusted from her father's old business circle, a weathered man named Frank Alvarez who had once investigated Denning years ago before the case went cold due to lack of evidence, and, as Frank admitted grimly, due to a payoff that had reached someone inside the department. With Vivian's financial records and Daniel's original contract as fresh evidence, Frank reopened the case quietly, working outside official channels at first to avoid tipping off whoever inside the system might still be protected by Denning's money. The tension built over the following weeks like a held breath, Daniel oscillating between hope that justice might finally arrive and fear that reopening old wounds would only bring more danger to his daughter's doorstep. Lily, sensing the anxiety in the around her without understanding its source, began asking Daniel more frequently if everything was okay, and each time he lied gently, telling her everything was fine, hating himself a little more for the lie each time he said it. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Daniel received a call from an unknown number, a voice he didn't recognize telling him, in a calm and almost polite tone, that he should convince Ms. Ashford to drop her investigation if he wanted his daughter to grow up with both parents around. An implied threat so smoothly in casual language that it took Daniel a full 10 seconds to understand what had just been said to him. He called Vivian immediately, his voice shaking with a fury he hadn't felt since the day he lost his house, and she arrived at the shop within 20 minutes, breathless, having driven faster than she should have. "We stop," Daniel said the moment she walked in, his voice hard. "This isn't worth it, Vivian. I don't care about the money anymore. I care about her." He gestured toward the back room where Lily was sleeping, unaware of the storm building around her small, safe world. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, not of surrender but of something more complicated, a mixture of guilt and resolve. "If we stop now," she said softly, "he wins and he'll do this to someone else, someone who might not have a Frank Alvarez or the resources I have. Daniel, I understand if you want out. This was never fair to ask of you, but I'm not stopping. I have to finish what my father started, even if finishing it means undoing everything he built." Daniel spent that night pacing the shop floor long after Vivian had gone, wrestling with the same question that had haunted him for 6 years disguised in a new, more dangerous form. How much was justice worth, and what price was he willing to let his daughter pay for it? He thought about his late wife, about the promise he had made at her hospital bed to always put Lily first, above pride, above anger, above everything. But he also thought about the version of himself that had let Walter Ashford's betrayal turn him quiet and small, hiding in a garage instead of demanding the world treat him with the dignity he deserved. And he realized that raising Lily to be strong meant showing what it looked like when her refused to be silenced by fear, not just once, but when it mattered most. The following morning, Daniel called Vivian and told her he was in, fully whatever came next, but only if they moved fast and moved smart, because he wasn't willing to let this drag on and put his daughter in the crosshairs any longer than necessary. Frank Alvarez, working with a small, trusted team, had already uncovered enough to bring formal charges, a paper trail linking Denning's shell companies not just to Walter Ashford's old scheme, but to at least 4 other similar operations across 2 states, families whose lives had quietly collapsed the same way Daniel's had, never knowing why. The evidence, once assembled, was overwhelming: bank transfers disguised as consulting fees, forged partnership documents, testimony from a former employee Dennings, who had grown a conscience after years of silence. Denning was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after that first threatening phone call, and the news made local headlines, though Vivian made sure Daniel's name stayed out of the press entirely, protecting the privacy she knew he valued above everything. In the quiet weeks that followed after the legal proceedings had begun and the immediate danger had passed, Vivian returned to the shop one evening carrying not a folder this time, but a simple envelope containing the check she had promised on that very first rainy night, the $40,000 owed finally repaid in full. But she also brought something else, a smaller envelope, which she handed to Daniel with hands that were steady now, no longer trembling the way they had that first night. Inside was a letter, handwritten, explaining that she had used part of her inheritance, money she no longer wanted to her father's legacy, to establish a fund for families who had lost everything to schemes like Denning's, and she wanted Daniel, if he was willing to help her run it, using his story, his resilience, and his knowledge of what it felt like to rebuild from nothing, to help others do the same. "I'm not asking you to forgive my father," she said, echoing words she'd spoken weeks before, but softer now, the sharp edges worn away by everything they'd survived together. I'm asking if you'll help me make sure his failures become someone else's second chance." Daniel stood in his shop, the same shop where this had all begun, holding a letter that represents not just financial restitution, but the strand gift of purpose emerging from 6 years of quiet suffering, and he looked over at Lily, who was coloring at the workbench, humming to herself, safe and unaware of how close danger had come to their door, and how far it had now retreated. He thought about the man he had been the night Vivian first walked in, guarded, bitter, convinced that trust a door that only opened to let more pain inside, and he realized had opened anyway, slowly, carefully, and what walked through it hadn't been more pain at all, but something closer to healing. "I'll help," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "But you should know, Vivian, I'm not doing this because of the money. I never was." She smiled, the first truly unguarded smile he had seen from her since that rainy night, and said she knew. Months later, the fund officially launched under a modest name had chosen for prestige, calling it simply the Secondchance Foundation, and its first case wasn't a stranger but a young mechanic 2 towns over who had fallen victim to a scheme eerily similar to the one that had once destroyed Daniel's life. Proof that Vivian's fears about history repeating itself had been justified, and proof too that this time, someone was finally standing in the way of it happening unnoticed. Daniel found himself, for the first time in 6 years, speaking publicly about what had happened to him, not out of a desire for sympathy, but because he understood now that silence was exactly what men like Denning and Walter Ashford rely on to keep operating, and every story told aloud was one more door closed to them. Lily, watching her father speak at a small community event about honesty, resilience, and second chances, tugged Vivian's sleeve during the applause and asked, with the innocent bluntness only children possess, "Is Daddy a hero now?" Vivian knelt down to Lily's level, watching Daniel across the room, steady, present, no longer hiding behind grease-stained hands and quiet resignation, and answered honestly, "He always, sweetheart. It just took the world a while to notice." The story of Daniel Reyes and Vivian Ashford was never a debt fully repaid, because some debts, the emotional ones, the ones measured in years stolen and trust broken, can never truly be settled with a number on a check. It was about what happens when someone chooses to stop in the sins of the past and instead uses the pain of it to build something for someone else. When a woman, by her father's failures, decides that legacy is not something you're born in, but something you actively choose every single day. And when a man who had every reason to remain closed-eyed instead to let one crack of trust into something that saves not just his own family, but strangers he will never fully know. And somewhere, in a small garage that once of oil and quiet grief, now filled with the sound of a little girl's laughter, and the low hum of 2 people rebuilding something of them expected to find, the rhythm of that rainy night lingers long after the credits of any story should end. That sometimes debts worth paying aren't written in dollars at all, but in the courage it takes to finally make things right.